Hi and welcome to the Recruitment and Beyond podcast. My name's Ewan Anderson. I'm the Marketing Director here at Eden Scott. This is your essential guide to navigating the ever-changing world of human resources and recruitment. We chat with industry-leading figures to give you the inside track on growing and developing the very best teams. Hi, and welcome back to the Recruitment and Beyond podcast. Today we are joined by Lynn White, who is the founder of Talent on Leave. Lynn, great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm fascinated by this actually. I want to get to really understand a wee bit more about this topic, and it's all about improving, I suppose, the opportunities and the chances for businesses to make more of maternity and parental leave, and ensuring that their staff really feel part of the organisation and come back refreshed and invigorated. So do you want to give us some insight into your background, and then just a little bit on how you got started with Talent on Leave?
Okay. I'll give you the abbreviated version. So my background was fairly unrelated. So I actually started in marketing. I left uni, ended up in London at a big ad agency, and I stayed in that world for 13, 14, maybe 15 years, something like that. So I was kind of client services, and I always had an interest in like the planning side of it. But, in client services, you're pulling the campaigns together, which you'll be familiar with doing. And I loved it. But I think the thing that I loved most about it, at the time, I would have said it was the variety. No 2 days were the same.
Sure.
But actually, I think what always tickled me and intrigued me was, why do people do what they do? Like, how do we affect behaviour change? And in particular, there were a couple of campaigns that I worked on which were about behaviour change, whether it was sexual health improvement or bowel cancer awareness. There were a few different ones of that genre, and every time they came into the agency, I'm like, I'll do it. And I did love all of that. I kept on in that career until I was pregnant with my third baby. And that's kind of where the Talent on Leave story begins, I think. Okay. So when I was pregnant with him, and this was back in 2015, I just had the fear, because I had been through having a baby twice, being in mat leave twice, and the kind of the dip in confidence and the kind of disorientation of just what a different experience it is compared to everything I'd ever known. And even when I was on to my second baby thinking, oh, well, this will be easier, it's just a different kind of tricky. And it was really out of that when I was having him, I thought there's got to be a better way to actually prepare for not just going on leave, not just professionally, but also personally. So the first time around, I had found it quite a shock to my system, going from being quite an A-type personality, the picture of ad agency, it's fast, it's fighting, it's attention to detail, it's go, go, go. And being a little bit of a perfectionist into, oh my God, I actually am a complete beginner again. And I can't control all of this. And no matter how hard I fight for a schedule, I can't actually get this baby into a routine. And there was just, it really took me down a notch, I would say, against a backdrop of not that much support. And I just remember feeling like, gosh, I've got family around me. What about people who don't?
Yeah.
And also that kind of sense of, why are our expectations as professional expectant parents built so high by the world around us, and yet we're not really properly prepared for the reality, which doesn't need to sink you. You just need to be prepared for it. So I had experienced postnatal anxiety the first time. I would say the second time it was more just like a general depletion. And when I was pregnant with my third, I was like, right, we're doing this differently. So I actually bumped myself into coaching. I found a brilliant perinatal counsellor and said, counselling's great, that's lovely. Can you actually be willing to coach at some points and mentor at some points? Because what I really want to do is learn about my personality, just grow my self-awareness so that I can create a more intentional plan for the decisions that I'm going to be making, both around my career, but also around what I want this leave experience to feel like and look like, and play with the art of the possible instead of the threat of the inevitable. And so that's what I did. And then just, wow, like I returned to work. I really felt it had worked. Went back to my job. By that point, I was freelancing as a consultant.
Okay.
And then just had this little niggle to share the approach wider. A lot of peers and friends were getting other people to come and talk to me. I was helping them. And then I was thinking, yeah, actually, if not now, when? Like, what could this look like? So when Harry, who's the littlest, turned 1, I then launched myself into a whole bunch of training. I did all the perinatal trainings. So I did the antenatal and birth, I did mental health, breastfeeding, all that stuff. But I also polished up and went and did an association for coaching, for general coaching, but with that emphasis on career and progression and outcome. And then I tied all that together into this approach, which we now call Talent on Leave. And in 2019, I joined eSpark, Entrepreneurial Spark as it was at the time. And that's now subsequently moved to the RBS Accelerator. Yeah. And so to be in a community like that, where you're being encouraged and come on, do something with this, it's got to go somewhere. And I had a great coach at the time as well, Danielle McLeod, and they were all just saying, go before you're ready. You will never perfect this to the level that you think it needs to be perfected. I think that kind of old agency marketing part of me was like, it needs to be campaign ready. And it's like, no, just go, not knowing exactly how the services are going to evolve, just get out there. And so that's what I did. And launched with an event, very boldly just invited a whole bunch of HR directors to an event which Pinsent Masons kindly hosted, gave me the space for, had a few speakers, told a bit of my story. And then from there were some just brilliant potential clients in there who put their hand up and said, let us evolve this with you. Let's change the narrative. Who I'm delighted to say I still work with today, which is lovely, like 5 years on. And so, so now Talent on Leave, the approach has evolved over the last few years into what I know tends to work well for various different sizes of companies. Will use it in different ways, but ultimately there are workshops for preparing for leave, preparing for return, and then return support, as well as one-to-one coaching, which a lot of companies like for their senior talent who are on that kind of leadership track, because I'm working with them monthly throughout their leave. And then some guides. Sometimes we'll help a company take their policy and bring it to life a little bit and actually see what we can tackle through that, which means that if they do use coaching, it's not just as an elastoplast for something that was preventable.
So do you think, just thinking of what you've just said there, and there's two sides to this, I guess, but, what is it that businesses are missing? Why do you think that they've never really looked at this properly? Is there a nervousness around this, around being able to chat to people when they're on maternity or parental leave? Is there, why are they missing the opportunities here?
I don't think it's intentional. And whilst fear does play a part, I don't think that's the initial driving force for what can look like inertia. And actually, if you look at the number of companies all over the UK, but Scotland's got a good share of them as well, who are really investing in enhanced leave and really embracing flexible working and kind of looking at all the ways they can improve the practicalities. I think that one of the biggest things that's missing is just art of the possible and like some joined up thinking. One of the things that I remember when I started out and not being able to prove until I could start doing it to show people was that what happens before and in leave is just as important as what happens at return. And that, yes, the financials are important, but there are so many other hundreds of moments along the way that really, really matter. And you've got an opportunity to actually fight that tide of conditioning and stereotypes from a much earlier stage. And look, as humans, we're hardwired to go for what we're comfortable with. And if the world spares us this story of stereotypes and, well, this is what happens when you're a parent, and this is what happens when you have an employee going on leave, then we're going to cling to that because it's all we know. And so when I started talking a lot about, And I think I actually put something on LinkedIn about this last week. It's like, if this was a leadership course, you guys, it would cost you an absolute fortune.
Yeah.
The only trouble with it is it's delivered at such pace and under such intense circumstances, the likes that, you know, what's that program, SAS, who deals with?
Yeah.
I think the pace and the intensity of it is like, it's hard to integrate that without being really intentional about it. And so I think what they're missing is being able to see that it is a huge opportunity, not just for someone to go out and add another dimension to their life, but also to transform some of those self-limiting behaviors and patterns that they maybe even had professionally and have been trying to improve for years before. Because you're suddenly in this intense period where you do need to have discernment, and you do need to be clear in your problem solving, and you do need to understand the power of the pause and the difference between a reaction and a response, and how to delegate and how to ask for help. And that's something senior talent who have come through a whole decade of school and university, and everything's externally marked and it's external validation, and suddenly you're in it and you have to find your own validation. Particularly in the UK, we don't have an awful lot of postnatal support in the UK, not the way we used to, or the way we should.
Right.
So I think that's what's missing, is just this sense of, well, that what happens on leave is not really our business. I'm like, but it could be, and you don't actually have to go around and change a nappy for that to happen.
Yeah, I guess, and so I suppose it's two sides, as I mentioned. On the other side, is there a big part of what you're doing here just to try and educate people to say, look, when you go on maternity or parental leave, it doesn't mean it's the end. It doesn't mean it's the stop. It doesn't mean you stop engaging with your organisation. Is there sometimes a bit of education for those that are on leave as well?
Absolutely, and I'm so glad you asked that. Somebody last week asked me about manager training, and I had said no. He said, why would you not do that? I'm like, well, actually, if you just think about most line managers, they're so busy firefighting, and particularly in the climate we're in right now, just keeping things moving, that to ask somebody to take time out their day, or even over 2 days, to be educated in the whole journey of leave, why? To what end? They're not going to remember. And if they do remember, they might not remember at exactly the right moment. And also, how do we know what they're carrying around this whole topic? Because it's enormous.
Yeah.
So my view has always been, yes, there are things we can do to support managers. And I've done a few things like that, but not formal training. And that when it comes to the individual, that's where the power really lies. Because if you've got somebody, what has always absolutely blown my mind, right, is that you can have this really brilliant, phenomenal, and I'm going to go with somebody female here, right, because it is a gap, and it remains a gap. But let's say you've got this brilliant senior female leader, and she's going to be going on leave, and she picks up the policy to have a wee look through what it's going to mean for her, her team, her manager, the rules, the do's, the don'ts, and you suddenly go from being this competent, high-achieving, all about town person to, oh my God, I'm a total hassle. And oh, right, and I can't do this and I can't do that. And you go from pilot to passenger.
Yeah.
And if there's one thing that I absolutely love doing, whenever it's a workshop or in one-to-one, is actually giving them the power back. And being able to say, this isn't about a you versus your employer. This is actually about you being willing to speak up and ask for what you need, and be willing to have conversations, and don't just stick with the conversation plan that's set out by a policy, because it doesn't know you. And it's so nuanced by individuals. So even if you could train a manager on the generalities, and it's the same reason I've never written a program or like a kind of log in and follow my content, because it's so nuanced to the individuals. Everyone's journey is so different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose everybody approaches this differently as well, don't they? I mean, having had our son, and then listen to a lot of the feedback that you get, everybody is completely different, as every child is. And so actually your approach to this has got to be individual, isn't it? You're absolutely right. It has to be an element of a policy that helps and guides and gives some suggestions, but it has to be an individual journey, doesn't it? And I suppose even just encouraging somebody to look at it differently and take a different approach to this is a key part of this. Almost a looking at somebody's psychology and saying, listen, we can help you, you know, point you in the right direction and give you some support here.
I think that's a really good point. And I think particularly because the way the world has conditioned us into almost playing a part when we go on leave, you know, I'll often talk about kind of archetypes in my work and be like, you know, we have that option of going into victim mode, which I don't like that word, but maybe they kind of meek, right? We go into meek mode, which is, oh, I'm going on leave, I better just follow all the rules and keep my head down and work really hard and do a great handover and just hope I've got a job when I come back. Hope they don't forget about me. And then you've got warrior mode, which is, right, I'm going to go in and I'm going to prove myself before I go, and I'm going to make sure they don't forget me, and I'm not handing that over until then, and I'm not stopping until this point. And actually, I'm going to be keeping in touch at this level, and I'm coming back after 4 months. I'm not waiting for a year because. So you can get these extremes, and then there's this kind of more sage approach, which is, right, well, hang on a wee minute here. Like, let's look at the bigger picture. And what's the story I'm telling myself? And actually, what's that kind of shitty first draft of that story? And how much of that is actually mine? And how much of that's what the world's taught me to assume and believe? And what am I projecting onto the people around me? What am I projecting onto my manager and onto my team and onto my employer about what is now inevitable? Rather than saying, well, actually, what are the good questions to ask here? And what's my truth? And can I go and say, telling myself a wee story here that you're going to forget me when I go and leave? How can I bring myself more personally into, right, well, let's talk about that and let's look at how we work with that. But it's about creating that environment for good conversation and helping people find their words.
Well, so I was just going to come around to that, actually, around communication and creating that environment where you feel like you can create whatever story you want, you know, whatever scenario you want. And you're absolutely right here, because it is such a personal thing. But I suppose here is around the balance between the employer and the employee, and things like having the right policy in place, or even just supporting managers to know how to support somebody to do that, almost leaving it to the employee to come to you and say, right, I'd like to structure it this way. I'd like my maternity or parental leave to look like this. Because there's obviously a balance between professional and personal life here. And I think we've got to be mindful of that. But I suppose it's, how do you create that scenario? And I guess a lot of it comes down to good communication. Would that be right?
I would say communication is essential. And I think having boundaries is also important. You know, policies are there for a reason. And one of the things I'll often hear HR directors when we first start chatting is they'll say it's creating consistency across departments is really hard. You know, you've got one manager who gets it and one who doesn't, and we're just trying to get everyone to stick to the rules because that's fair. And I don't think that it's a case of saying that everyone's leave transition or everyone's return transition or everyone's keeping in touch, what that should look like should be the same. But I do think that there are sticks in the ground. You know, you've got your waypoints and you've got the right, this is the general way we do things. But what is it that's flexible within that? So what's the trial and error opportunity that's there? And a lot of the time when people are asking for what they need, they're not asking for anything that goes against policy or that's going to overly compromise the company. It's more about, I just need you to hear me, and I need to feel that I'm psychologically safe enough to interact with this policy, and that whilst you're saying I can do this, that I'm not going to be penalised if I do. And actually, all, you know, from a return point of view, there are so many questions that people have about return that they don't want to ask. And the same with managers. Managers want to ask a whole load of stuff that they're scared to ask because they're like, what if I get it wrong? What if I say the wrong thing or unintentionally offend, or they think I'm discriminating against them? But because everyone's got, like, you know, we talk about the glass ceiling. I think with leave, there's this glass wall. Like, I can see you and I can see you mouthing, but I can't really hear you properly because I'm so busy worrying about what I'm going to say next.
Yeah. Is that the biggest challenge you come up against? Is that fear of what if I say something wrong? What if I get this wrong here? Is that from an employer's point of view? Would that be right?
Yeah, I think on both sides, I see it. And that is fear-based, and that does come from what the world has taught us around discrimination and what will happen if. And it's become an experience that has been so policified isn't a word, but, you know, it's been so legislated, and rightly so, rightly so. However, at the expense of good communication. And I don't think managers need to have a script, and I don't think they need to have intense training. I think they need to have 2 or 3 good coaching questions that they can ask on any given conversation in order to listen. And as long as there's an air of, I'm listening, you tell me your truth, I'll tell you mine, right? Let's compromise and collaborate, right? How do we, not just here's the policy, but how do we interact with this policy in a way that works for both of us? And I think a lot of that comes back down to, again, you know, we have got a lot of parents in the world. We can't pretend parenthood doesn't happen. And we can't pretend that it's just a big expense to business, because it's not. It does reap rewards. Yeah. However, I think we need to kind of get to the narrative of, do you know what? The employer and employee relationship is always a trade. It's always you know, I am really looking forward to coming back to work, you know, having prepared properly. Here's what I'm really looking forward to about coming back. And here are the skills I'm looking forward to using again. Here's what I think that could look like. What do you think it could look like, so that we can do this in a way that feels like it's working for both of us? Because if that emotional engagement is not there for somebody returning, particularly at a senior level when they're coming into kind of a busy job, a busy life again, what's the trade-off? Because it's got to emotionally engage almost as much as that wee one at home.
Yeah, I mean, and not to play devil's advocate again, but on the flip side, is it that companies just need some structure around this? They need something, that they need a kind of, because it is very individual, and I completely understand why that's the case. But can you see how companies might need that structure to say, look, we need some kind of parameters in here? Is that, or is it a case where, you know, it really is dependent on the culture here? And if the culture is such that people feel comfortable to have those discussions, then we can have a more mature approach than somewhere where it's perhaps communication is not quite as strong, or people don't feel as comfortable talking.
Yeah, I think it's both. One of the things that I have done with the guides, and I say I don't do loads and loads of them because they're quite involved, but one of the things we'll do with those is actually take the policy and the processes that the company have and actually weave that through with the kind of coaching content and guidance that takes it not just, here's everything you need to know about parental leave, or here's everything you need to know about what happens if you have a miscarriage, but we're actually putting it into an order in which somebody may experience this whole journey, and we're pulling out the bits of policy and processes that are relevant, and we're putting in the content that helps them feel good to know what conversations should I be having, how might I have them, both from a management perspective and also from the person experiencing leave or return. So something as simple as that can make a huge difference. And it's almost like a kind of saying, this is how we do things here. So there's that side of it, like, you can have great policies, but how do you make them human? And equally, I've got people who can't afford enhanced policies. You know, there's some SMEs that have started joining into what I'm doing recently, and I'm like, well, okay, let's work with what you can do. Let's see what is possible, and let's see what the things are that aren't going to cost you a lot of money, but are going to have a huge impact on that person's experience and their engagement with you, so that they can come back with energy.
Yeah. I mean, that was one of the questions I was going to ask, actually. Is this something that you've seen that works better with a larger organization with lots of structure, and it allows people to, to feel comfortable coming back into that space, or it works better in a smaller, more dynamic company where communication is just part and parcel of what happens in the organization?
I think it works with both. I would say with maybe a smaller company, you might see the effect of it quicker. Because the ripple effect is so much more profound, because it's rippling out more immediately. Other people, even from other parts of the business, will feel it. There's always a ripple effect of this kind of work. And I would say within the corporate world, and where you've got much bigger departments, there are some companies I work with where I'm still meeting people and saying, oh my God, I didn't know we had you. That's amazing. And I've been working with them for 3-4 years. But it's just that the ripple effect maybe takes a little bit longer to go beyond just the management and the team and the department. So it can work for everyone. I think in terms of getting bang for your buck. It's about being clever about where you actually feel the need. So like an SME is more likely to want to support the conversation at that one-to-one level and the nuance, and they're strategically very dependent on that individual coming back. With corporate, I do a lot more. I do a lot of one-to-one for kind of talent level, but there will also be a lot of kind of bespoke workshops. So we're building culture as much as we're building the knowledge and the behaviours.
That's great, Lynn. Thank you. Well, listen, we'll be back after this short break. Do you get much feedback from those who don't have kids? Is there a bit of a you talked about trade-offs, but is there a bit of resentment sometimes, or is it generally, again, going back to the culture that whoever's leading that organisation has created ensures that this can roll out without too much issue?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important outcomes of any of the ways we apply the approach will be that self-awareness that you're creating in people.
Aye, yeah.
And I don't think that has to be limited to just the person taking leave or just the manager. I think that it's also possible to create some self-awareness in the wider team through your communications, through the signals you're sending out in your culture, through the messages that you're giving to people about, without, and this is where we've got to be careful. Sometimes I'll see on LinkedIn people talking about, parents and we're this and we're that, because I've been on leave, we're amazing and we can multitask and everything else. And I'm like, right, you are, so can other people.
Yeah.
I think with non-parents, we've got to remember some of them are non-parents not through choice.
Yeah.
They will have had their own experiences. Some of them are through choice. And that everybody will have their own reactions to a member of their team going on leave based on a whole load of conditioning we can't see.
Absolutely.
And that can create a defensiveness. And again, it can have us go to those hardwired tendencies to look for all the evidence around why this is going to be a pain in the butt. But I do think we can create a more intentional dynamic around that. And I think that it's about both the parent going on leave or returning knowing, I'm coming at this from quite a defensive viewpoint, right? Who do I want to be in this conversation? Who do I want to be in that handover with my team? Rather than going to that fight or flight reaction, which we're led to. The world's taken us there. And the same for the team is like being aware of, right, really not a big fan of mat leave. It leaves me a lot of work, right? Well, how are we positioning that at a cultural level within the company? And what messages are they getting? And you know what? Everyone's experiencing that leave. Yes, the person going on leave and the manager are experiencing it way more intensely. The parent are, like, without a doubt.
No, absolutely.
But you've got all these team members left behind who are also experiencing leave. So what are we doing there? And how are we helping it to become a chapter that they can thrive into?
Yeah, no, and you made a really good point about that self-awareness and everybody just taking that ownership there and almost feeding that into the culture of the organisation to say if everybody looks at this from that point of view, has a bit of self-awareness and really looks at this as an opportunity to try and develop the company, to build the company, to take every opportunity we can, then actually, it creates a better scenario for everybody to get on. Sorry, carry on.
Sorry. You must see, like, obviously with the work that Eden Scott do, like, you must see this topic coming into conversations quite a lot around people using this as a moment where they think about, right, am I going back to that job or am I moving on? Or when they're even attracting talent, thinking about what's the message we want for that senior talent who maybe are likely to be thinking about family soon or have one already. Does that something that you see quite a lot?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this comes back to culture. We do see, we do absolutely do, these conversations come up regularly. People I think different companies have different approaches, but I think certainly from a culture point of view, it almost comes back to communication, open communication, and creating an environment where people feel comfortable to do that. Because I'll be honest, until I'd spoken to you, I hadn't thought as in depth as we've gone into around this topic, because I guess I had never looked at it in terms of the way you've described it, in terms of that opportunity, and that's on me. 100%.
You're not alone. Don't beat yourself up. Like
Yeah.
that's not what we have been trained to believe or to see. Like even and I've got some incredible HR clients, and I adore them. And even they would say, you kind of know there's opportunity there, but you don't know how quite to tap into it.
Well, I suppose that's where my earlier questions were around that nervousness, because for twofold, from my point of view, is really understanding where the opportunity lies, and secondly, just understanding how to approach that opportunity. But you've laid it out in a really clear way to suggest that this comes from the employee to say, this is how I want this to look, and the employer being able to be in a position to say, okay, we can help you with that, and actually that's going to help us both. We're both going to be in a great position when you come back to take on your role. So I think,
or if we can't, at least we are all aware of our choices, because we all have choice, right? And nobody needs to fall out or leave company because they were scared to ask.
And I think that's it. It's creating that scenario where you're not scared to ask. You're, and it's not. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's an element of challenge here. It's being able to say, look, I want to look at it this way. Can we sit and have a conversation about it? And again, as I say, it wasn't something that I think I had. You put it really well at the start. We're all conditioned to think in a certain way, because that's the way it's always been. And as I said, I hadn't thought about it from a talent on leave position. And it's really refreshing to have a think about that, because I think there are definitely some people who will look at this and think, right, that's me. Am I going to go back into that job? Do I want to go back into that job and take it as an opportunity? But I think there's some people who I feel quite nervous about going back in, because they know they've got that balance of childcare and trying to find themselves and find themselves in work again, because work goes on as well. Things move on, things transition. And sometimes if communication is not as strong as it could be, then you miss out on a lot of that. So I think it's really important.
Exactly that. And what I'd really love to add to that point is, a really common thing that will be asked when people are preparing for return, if I've not worked with them before, and they'll be saying, I'm due to go back and I'm not sure if this is where I'm going back to. A lot of the time, it's not about the practicalities. It's not about having the conversation around working hours or flexibility. It's often around role.
Yeah.
But the biggest thing of all is often around, I left that person, I'm now this person. Absolutely. And actually, as I go back into this, is this still the right fit? Yeah. And it's not necessarily about the practicalities, it's about the values. It's about what really matters. And actually, there's often a reflection on who I was before in my job. So you will get people, particularly in professional services, where they have had really intense jobs, they've worked big hours, they got to where they got to, being such over performers, over functioners. And then they're saying, I don't know if it's going to be possible to have it all. Yeah. And then we have these beautiful conversations around define it all. Like, what is it all? And let's redefine that for you, because you can't have it all. You can have your all. But how much of your all that you had before was based on made up stuff around what success looked like? And sometimes when you can catch people at that point, they realize it's not a new job I need. It's a new awareness around myself and how I show up and how I succeed.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's a new awareness around who you are and what's important to you and what's where the values are. And I completely changed my approach. No, that's not true. I definitely changed my approach to work when I obviously when we had our son. It completely changed the narrative, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for that or not. But actually being able to have that conversation with the team, knowing fine well that they were quite comfortable with that and can help us along with that was great. And I think it completely changes the dynamic of the person, doesn't it? And it's really important to understand that. Like you say, it's because I was going to ask, actually, has it changed with flexible working? Has flexible working had an impact on this? Because a part of that coming back is support from colleagues, sitting around the table, having a coffee, just getting to know people again, which isn't as easy perhaps online.
Well, I love this topic. How long do we have? Right. So flexible working, has it got easier? I'll answer that part first. Yes, I think it is more and more a conversation point. People are less scared to ask. We know that. We know that it's what people want. The return to office mandates at the moment are really interesting. Because some of that, you kind of wonder, is that for appearance's sake? Is it for a keeping up with the Joneses? And how much of it is based on actual genuine performance and productivity? Also that there are some levels that are more able to work remotely or to work hybrid because of the stage they're at in their careers. I would say most of the people that I work with actually really love hybrid. What happens is they, at least a couple of days in the week, they've got a little bit of time back in their day rather than constantly commuting. That helps them do that over functioning part, like out with their contracted hours. They're like that, right, I'm going to get that done and that done. Their focus is just like, they just get straight to it without thinking about the commute. But they do value going in and meeting with their colleagues. They do. And I don't think, certainly none of the senior talent I work with have got the view of, I just want to work from home all the time.
No.
But I'm interested to see how that changes over the next 5-10 years, different generations, and what their expectations are.
So Lynn, tell us, what does good look like? What does success look like in terms of this?
I think for a business, good looks like intention. It's not burying your head in the sand. It's being more willing to look at leave without going, bleh, and actually thinking, what actually, if this was easier? What if this was an opportunity? What would that look like for our business? What could we reverse? What challenges are we seeing with leave, and how might we combat them, instead of just assuming we've just got to put up with it because that's just how it is? And I think when a company does that, you find the right formulas, maybe not quite the right word, but the right alchemy for your business. Where you've got a balance between policy and an actual lived experience, and just enough elastic in that to create something consistent across the business, but still allow for kind of person-led conversations, that even when you can't provide everything an employee is looking for, you are actually seeing their professional potential, and you're making space for them to be able to come and bring it back. And I think I would say it's hard to do that without giving individuals this space to reflect on that for themselves. I would say that's probably what good looks like from my perspective of what businesses should be doing. And I've got my wee top 3 tips. I
was just going to say, yes, if you can give us your top 3 tips for businesses looking at this, that'd be great.
It was hard to keep it to 3. I would say the first thing is just to shift the narrative, like move from the old narrative's not working. It's not been working for decades. So let's move to a new narrative of what's the art of the possible. How can we reframe our views of maternity and parental leave in our business? What are they right now, and be willing to look at how ugly they might be, because we've all got them. My gosh, before I had kids, I had some ugly views around it. I'm quite ashamed of some of the conversations I had around part-timers. Like, good Lord, like, right, I learned the hard way. Maybe that's why my first leave was tricky. It was like karma. But I think that, like, be really honest about your current views and conditioning around leave, question it, and actually decide on what a new narrative could look like, and at least experiment with it. For the experimentation, it's like create an intentional approach. So really think about how you don't just build policy, but the individuals. How do you build people? How do you help them grow and harness that growth? And yes, the individuals, but also the managers, and also the team that are going to be there, and what the ripple effect is that you want. And through that, your culture happens and your EVP improves. So to look at how you're bringing your intentions to life. And kind of looking at that whole journey from career to leave and back, and all the curveballs that can happen along the way, all the little alleyways, and then measure what you do try. Because one of the things that I wish I'd started right at the beginning of Talent on Leave was going into those companies and benchmarking and saying, right, give me what your progression rates look like, please. Because the one thing I know we have done, but I didn't have their initial figures, was the majority, not all of them, but the majority of the senior talent that come in, they've all been promoted. They're all progressing. Doesn't mean they don't struggle. No, because we're all human and we all have our struggles. But I think it comes back to that weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. And I kind of think, career confidence and I can do this might wobble, but you won't fall down. And the real beauty in all of this is being able to help everyone to carry leave just a little bit more lightly. And I think going into working parenthood, and even now there's some people that I'll work with who returned a year or 2 years ago, and they're like, what the actual? And it's when you actually sit down and say, it's not necessarily all the plates you're spinning, it's the weight of emotion that you've got on each plate.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
And I think that when we can look at how we use that whole journey from career to leave and back, about how do we stop those plates piling up? How do we stop the snowballing of that negative psychology of ourselves, of leave, of our prospects thereafter? Then that can make a big difference. So, benchmark, measure it, and then have a wee look and see, well, what is the cost opportunity of this? Because what do we stand to lose? What do we stand to lose? The cost of attrition swap between 30 and 100, depending on the level of the talent.
Sure.
Pilot is like a fraction, and you get to decide what matters most and work on that and see, can you afford that leadership course?
Absolutely. That sounds great. Listen, thank you very much for your time today, Lynn. It's been a great discussion.
Much for having me.
Really interesting. And as I said, it's completely changed my approach to this. Completely changed my mind.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I just doing some reading on this before and just really trying to understand it, I think has really opened my eyes to, as you said, what is possible. Why, what is possible here? And
go check out those neuroscience maps.
Absolutely. But thank you very much. So listen, if people want to find out a bit more, how can they get in touch with you?
I will pop you a little note there's some good stuff coming up in the second half of this year, some exciting new things, which if I start talking about now, we'll be here another hour. So I'll hold off on that. But there's that, and there's also a couple of wee events that I have coming up as well. So if I send you a little link, then maybe you can add that to the transcript or something.
Absolutely. We'll put that in the show notes. Absolutely.
Please connect with me on LinkedIn. I love a good blather. And if there's anything that's come up that you think for your company you could do with a wee half an hour chat on, I keep 4 half-an-hour chats aside every month, just to kind of do a little payback. So, if you're looking at this and thinking we have no budget, or my manager will think this is fluff, but you want a 30-minute chat, you'll find all my details on LinkedIn.
Brilliant. And we'll put them in the show notes as well. So thank you very much for your time, Lynn. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for making it comfy. Bye.
Thank you. Cheers. That's great. Thanks for listening to the Recruitment and Beyond podcast. Hopefully there was plenty of insight for you to take back to your teams. So don't forget to subscribe and never miss an episode. And if you can, leave us a review. We really appreciate all the feedback and support we get. It makes a massive difference.